Welcome to Navigating Net Zero, where we explore the challenges and opportunities of taking climate action in the real world. Each episode, your host Alexia Kelly sits down with leading climate change professionals and experts for honest conversations about what it means to make net zero a reality. Thanks for joining us. Let's dive in.
Welcome to another episode of Navigating Net Zero, where we talk about what's working, what's not, and what's next on the global journey to net zero. I'm your host, Alexia Kelly, and I'm absolutely delighted to be joined here today by my longtime friend and colleague, Holly Ladd. Holly has spent her career at the intersection of carbon accounting and energy strategy. From 2009 to 2011, Holly was part of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Scope 3 and Product Lifecycle Standards Project team. That's actually where we met when I was at WRI in 2009.
Shared a wall.
We did. And her 8 years of experience working at Fortune 100 companies really gave her that firsthand knowledge of internal processes that companies are working through to set climate targets and execute decarbonization investments. So going from the standard setting space to implementation in the real world. Holly has negotiated energy supply and renewable energy power purchase agreements in regulated and wholesale energy markets. And we'll talk a little bit about regulated and wholesale energy markets today. And has provided expert witness testimony in electric utility dockets, analyzed utility rates and energy market data to enable distributed solar energy storage and demand response projects, and worked as a regulator for a while. So, Holly, it's an absolute pleasure to have you here today. Thank you so much for joining me and really looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Looking forward to it.
So let's jump right in. You've had a rare and unique vantage point really sitting in different parts of the climate action ecosystem, including helping write the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Scope 3 standard, serving as a government energy regulator, and now working on the corporate buy side. How have those experiences shaped the way you think about what's working and what's not in the corporate standard space today?
Great question. It's really been a journey, and I think we all have to be open to have new ideas and new experiences and change our mind, and I definitely have in my career from standards to implementation. So I joined the Greenhouse Gas Protocol in 2009, kind of fresh out of school, as they say. I actually found the other day my first environmentally extended input-output data set on a CD-ROM. That's how nerdy I was about this stuff in the mid-2000s, and how I really thought that, there's so much energy about what are value chain emissions, how do we extend our decarbonization strategy to supply chains, emerging data tools were being developed to help that. It was an exciting time. Learned a lot from companies who were on really that leading edge of what became the Scope 3 standard. Because if you think back to the mid-2000s, late 2000s, Scope 3 meant business travel. And that's great that they were doing that. But we knew there were all these other emissions out there. There were risks posed by them. Really going through the process of defining what that meant, learned a ton. Coming out of that, I got really into electricity because it's one of the most vital products, except for storage, which is really cool. We should talk about that. It's a just-in-time delivery system, major climate impacts, and everybody needs it, and we have to control costs. So when you think about all the pieces that make it complex, it's one of actually the most complex parts of the energy transition and climate strategy. We've also had great success there. We should talk about why that is. But in the US, we're really lucky or cursed, depending how you look at it, to have actually very different energy markets. So I worked in a state regulator that is a fully regulated monopoly electricity state. So when the utility wants to build a new power plant or raise its rates, it goes through a quasi-judicial system, similar to the old days when you had your one long-distance telephone provider. Other states decided to deregulate electricity like they did with telephones, and you can pick and choose who you want to be your supplier of electricity. And so the way these states evolve their energy markets are really unique, and turns out really dictates what type of low carbon renewable electricity actions companies can take of where they're located or not. I think the US is interesting because we have a mix of fully deregulated or competitive markets, fully regulated, and then kind of these ones in the middle where they're regulated, but they have this wholesale trading infrastructure companies can use. And that's in contrast to like most of Europe, which is pretty much completely competitive. And so I think that experience has helped shaped how I think about how electricity market structures influence what companies can and can't do effectively.
Yeah, I think that so much to dig in there. And I think we should come back to electricity market structure and regulatory oversight systems and what a huge impact that has on sort of what is accessible, what is available for companies, what is cost competitive. But before we dig into that, say a few more words just about electricity and how it relates to corporate greenhouse gas footprints and inventories and why it is such a hugely important and complicated set of topics to be digging into.
Yeah, happy to, because electricity is in everything, even things you wouldn't necessarily think of. So I think most people can get their minds around for a company's kind of their own emissions, which is you have heating equipment in your buildings, you have the lights on, maybe you own or lease some vehicles. Electricity is obviously going to be a big portion of your emissions. And for most companies and greenhouse gas speak, their scope 2 is the largest source emissions of their total scope 1 plus 2. So from like their direct sphere of what they actually operate, electricity is a major part. What is actually in some ways more interesting for me is back to those old CD-ROMs of data sets. We see what companies buy out thousands of different products and services. They sell a variety of products that customers use. And when you start to do like multi-layer life cycle assessment, people call these different things deep value chain analysis. Terminology varies. You start to realize, oh, when I buy different professional services, when I buy cement, when I buy different steel products, turns out those things take a lot of electricity to make. And so when you start to instead, like I keep doing this because like this horizontal look at it of what are the actual fuel sources, energy sources used to make all those things. One company I worked at, we found when we did that, like nearly 50% of our scope 3 emissions came from electricity. And so that you start to really think about, well, we're actually fairly good at decarbonizing electricity through renewable energy, increasingly energy storage. How do we do more of that and kind of get closer to the root source of scope 3 emissions and potentially instead of kind of meandering through a bunch of product invoice data sets? So it's just a different kind of way of looking at the world and actually opens up different opportunities.
Let's talk about that for a minute, because I do think that often there's sort of this vilification of if it's inside your supply chain and it's clean, it's good. If it's outside of your supply chain and it's dirty, it's bad. And I think what I hear you saying and what we see all the time is really it's way more complicated than that. So
Yeah.
you could have a product that is generally recognized as low carbon. And to your point, if it was coal-fired generators that were delivering and powering all of the electricity to make that product, the life cycle emissions impact of that product is going to look really different than if it was a fully renewably driven production process. And so this idea that you have to reach back into value chains and upstream into value chains and figure out ways to connect the accounting dots across all of this hugely complicated supply chain and sets of interventions is, I think, one of the things that we're really collectively grappling with right now. And obviously, when you were at WRI in the early days of the Scope 3 standard, like all of this was really just kind of new ground that folks were covering.
Yes.
Based on sort of what you've learned since then, are there things that you wish you knew when you were writing the Scope 3 standard for the first time? And what do you think that implies for kind of where we go now in terms of the standard space?
Yeah, great question. I think it helps to do some time travel to think about the issues in the climate space we were all talking about circa 2008 to 2011 when the Scope 3 standard was being developed. I vividly remember seeing you in your office and thinking about, in the US at least, we were closest we ever came to of having national cap and trade system. There was a lot of belief by many that there was going to be regulations on carbon emissions. With that background, the Scope 3 standard was really about companies be able to see all of their risks, carbon risks, in their value chain, which do go all the way back for material extraction to all the way downstream of customers using their product, disposing it. Because if there's a price on carbon, that affects the price of all of those transactions and products. And they need to see that and then work on those risks. That future didn't materialize. We also had a belief at the time the world was going to be awash of product carbon footprint data, EPDs, all of the acronyms. And sometimes I see some of those reports about the need for EPDs, and they're written in 2025, and they could have been the same report written in 2010. And I would love to have a world full of LCAs where you can really integrate that directly into company decision making. But that world also didn't materialize that way. What I think I wish I would have known then that I know now is that size matters in decarbonization of value chains and companies themselves. You need to have enough of your target of what you're focusing on, in this case, if it's electricity. If I only have 100 megawatt hours to decarbonize, the tools I can leverage to do that are very different than if I have 1 million megawatt hours. And so we were very focused, I feel like, at Scope 3 about tracing all the emissions back to their root source and assigning it to products. But if you actually think about it, we should probably be looking at how much natural gas, electricity, different agricultural emissions we have, bundle that up and do bigger projects. Because if you don't have a lot to work with, you're not going to be as effective in doing long-term project finance that get these things off the ground.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's talk a little bit about this as well, because you mentioned, and I think we actually don't spend enough time thinking about why and how this happened. We have seen enormous success in renewable energy technology, both kind of cost coming down and adoption just skyrocketing, not just in developed countries, but also around the world. But it's been patchy, and not every, I think I hear a lot, oh, well, all renewables are cost competitive now, therefore they're all additional, therefore we shouldn't need to incentivize them through any kind of environmental markets, whether those are, renewable energy certificates or carbon credits or any of the other instruments that we've historically used to address that price difference between an incumbent dirty technology and a cleaner, greener technology. And so maybe just, I would love to hear you reflect on the role that you see both government intervention and regulation playing in helping to accelerate adoption of these technologies, and also the role of voluntary corporate purchasing, because this is a hotly debated topic right now, and I know you have a unique perspective on both those issues.
Oh, if I had a nickel for every time I saw a headline like solar is unstoppable, renewables like least cost form of energy, and this translating that into our world that, well, companies shouldn't get credit for buying renewables anymore. Like, it's actually getting harder to make those deals pencil, and we actually need the voluntary market more than ever. But I think there's been great success on the regulatory side, either through government procurements like we have in Europe and in the US, these kind of renewable portfolio, renewable energy standards that I'm more familiar with that say, hey, the government says, look, utility, you need to procure 30% of your electricity has to come from renewable sources. The states, again, in the late 90s, early 2000s, developed the REC tracking system as we have it today to do the math for compliance. And what's really helpful about that is not only is it effective, but when the voluntary market came about in the 2010s, it could piggyback on the system those states had created in all of the tracking. And so it wasn't an accident that renewables took off. There's a number of factors that went into making the last decade a booming success in the corporate renewable space. And having that compliance system already in place and building off of it is one of those factors.
Yeah, and I know you've done a huge amount of analysis and research just trying to understand, what does the role of corporate purchasing play in helping bring new renewables online or provide incentives for existing renewables? Say a few more words about what the literature is telling us about the role of renewable energy certificates in particular, both bundled and unbundled. Maybe explain what that means and just how that's, helped us move things forward collectively.
Yeah, and I think these lessons are not only applicable to renewable energy, but these same kind of procurement learnings I think, translate very closely to the Scope 3 emerging
Absolutely.
instruments, if you will. It's at the end of the day, this is people buying stuff. And so kind of I personally don't like to use bundle and a bundle because people actually have different meanings of it. So when I was on the GHG protocol Scope 2 working group, people were suggesting using these terms I can't remember what the requirement was. And I was like, well, is a virtual power purchase agreement bundled or unbundled? And we did a poll, and roughly 2/3 thought it was bundled and 1/3 thought it was unbundled. So I was like, that kind of proves my point. Like, it's more about, and I think RE100, the campaign to get companies to set renewable energy commitments, does as well. They're like, is it a long-term contract? Is it a new asset? And if not, how old is the asset? How old is the wind farm, the solar facility? But kind of stepping back, I had a boss once tell me, price doesn't get renewable projects done, credit does. So if you are a policymaker and a system planner, you are trying to answer the question, how should the optimal electricity system be designed to give me reliable, affordable, and low carbon electricity? And that's a great question to ask. When you're trying to build, let's say, a solar farm in Iowa, which is next door to me, you're actually answering, how can I make sure this facility, I get enough revenue to cover my costs of this project over its financial life? And how do I convince a bank or a equity firm that I can do that? And if I could leave nothing else for listeners of that those are two very different questions, that would be amazing. Because from a planner perspective, if you don't have to think about debt coverage, if you don't think about rate base and depreciation curves and profit motives and tax credit sunsets, renewables look least cost on a megawatt hour basis. But that is all of that I just said, the investor cares about, the person who's extending their money to make this project happen. And that's where, renewables are cheap, but I've negotiated many projects. I negotiated one in the late 20-teens, like 2018, circa that time in Texas. This was below $20 a megawatt hour. So to help people understand, it was below 2 cents a kilowatt hour on your electric bill. And I said to the developer, why do you need my power purchase agreement? This is clearly in the money. Look at all the forecasts. And they're like, I can't get financing unless I have a power purchase agreement.
Yeah.
I've seen that project with $10 a megawatt hour, 1 cent a kilowatt hour. And so I will just say the best analogy I've seen to help people understand it is kind of like you want to buy your first house and you've graduated college and you have this degree. And studies say that people with this degree make, I don't know, $75,000 a year, which will be enough for you to buy this house in this very affordable market, apparently. And you go to the bank and they're like, look, I have this study. I should be able to buy this house. And the bank's going to say, that's funny. Where's your W-2? Yep. You have to have the credit and the commitment that you, not the system, you can pay for that project. And so that's why PPAs are always going to be important to provide de-risk revenue of projects. And the value of that PPA varies significantly of volatile energy markets. And so people think, oh, these are making money for companies who are signing them. Sometimes they do, but there's been many months I saw big checks we had to write to the developers, and you're really just wearing that risk. And so that's kind of my risk 101 diatribe. But I think people who work in system planning models or electricities are called often capacity expansion models, fail to look at what questions are we actually answering. And once you do that, you realize we're going to need PPAs forever. And if not the voluntary market, then who? Who's going to take this position? And they often tell me, oh, banks will. I've never seen a bank who wanted to take on a specific point in a market on a specific project technology. Yeah. That's not true. So,
but, and I think
you can see I'm worked up about it.
I think the renewable energy space is just such an interesting case study for us to be thinking about as regulators and standard setters, because that's obviously how I sort of approach a lot of these issues. And this question of how do we manage and assess rapidly evolving and changing market dynamics and pricing dynamics and kind of purchasing dynamics, like all of that in the context of creating a very clear, transparent, and standardized set of rules that enable you to hopefully compare apples to apples is really challenging and super important. I think a lot of the conversation we're having right now about electricity really revolves around that central question, which I think is a fair one, right? If I'm a company and I want to contribute to helping decarbonize something, you care about what we call in carbon credit markets additionality. You care about whether or not whatever the thing you're doing, if it's signing an offtake agreement, if it's paying the premium, if it's covering the cost delta between the wholesale electricity prices as in a VPPA, virtual power purchase agreement, whatever the thing is that you're doing, like you want to be able to look at that thing and say, yep, that thing made a difference. It caused something new to happen in the world. And I want to be able to get some sort of credit and recognition for having taken that action. And I think that's where the wheels are sort of coming off the bus of the current inventory-based target accounting system in particular that we're trying to use, which is that it just doesn't work that way in the real world, especially with highly commoditized, intermingled, very liquid markets like electricity. And so looking ahead and thinking about the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Scope 2 consultation out right now, and really what like reasonable approaches to assessing additionality is, and thinking about what role did I as a company play in helping bring new capacity on or take capacity off that we don't
Yes.
want anymore, e.g. coal, like what does that look like and how do we really think about that in a systematic way?
Yeah, I wish we would all start backwards on this, which is you want to build a solar project in country X. What are the requirements to get that financed and built? And without the corporate, like, who specifically would do it? Because
Yeah.
that's where there's always some mythical somebody else. I'm like, no, there's not. So it's really about taking a long-term commitment to buy something, and something being electricity, which nice thing about wind and solar is their operating costs are nearly zero, but that means they're all in on the capital cost. So I really think that mortgage example helps people understand, like the bank's lending you a bunch of money at year zero, and they're looking for proof that you can pay it back over 20, 30 years. For power purchase agreements, they want to see a 15-year, plus or minus a few years, depending on the lender, offtake agreement that says this company is going to back this power purchase price at $50 a megawatt hour. So no matter what happens in the market pricing, I will get $50 a megawatt hour for my electricity. And I think when we think about the really exciting developments in lower carbon cement production, steel, a lot of these hard to decarbonize sectors, heavy duty trucking, think about it. A lot of those are very upfront, capital intensive, take a long time to pay back. And so having a multi-year commitments to something that you're going to backstop that project so it's not a risky revenue source, that's the best thing companies can do. And I'd like to posit, and maybe it's controversial because there's a lot of people who work inside companies on supplier engagement programs and things like that. Companies, what are they best at? They're best at having credit and buying stuff. We should just lean into that because that's the gap we have, is financing risky and or expensive projects that we need to decarbonize the economy. Who's good at that? Companies. But why would they do it unless they have certainty that it can count towards their goals?
It's so true. And I think this really complicated interaction of finance and financial structuring with just market dynamics, and then also sort of how do you set that clear and objective set of kind of one size fits all rules, I think is sort of, it's colliding right now all over the place, right? And I think that coming to some sort of essentially just mutual recognition that, look, we will be crediting things that were not entirely driven by voluntary purchasing commitments. We still need to enable the companies to say something about that. And that should be clear, transparent, and it should matter enough to keep, particularly in the case of the tech companies, what now amounts to billions of dollars that they have either invested in long-term offtake agreements, which means you agree to purchase a thing, usually at a fixed or variable price over a specific period of time, say 5 years, 10 years. As we're thinking about standards evolution, making sure that we are not stranding those assets, that we are not saying, oh, yeah, that thing you did on a voluntary basis in accordance with the rules 5 years ago does not count anymore, is going to be really problematic.
Yeah. And for those who have are nerds like me and have dug into the GHG protocol scope 2 comment period documents, that was the biggest disappointment, was that companies are looking for certainty. We'll call it legacy clauses. So what's that transition between new and old rules going to look like? If I signed a 15-year contract in 2020, can I claim it through 2035 and how? And they didn't put out a proposal. They just said, we're thinking about some of these things. What do you think it should be? And they're just creating further uncertainty by not even having a proposal or to put feedback on. And I think that was a major punt, but it raises a larger question of scope 2 was, I'm going to make an argument here, was never designed around the goal of stimulating renewable energy development. It was answering how do we put RECs in attributional inventories? And I know you have some state regulatory background yourself. When you're a state regulator, you read the statute and you go word by word to figure out intent and interpretation. I would, on a rainy day where you have no internet or something and need something to do this with the scope 2 guidance, everybody. Actually read it. And then you tell me if you think the intent of it, the main intent, was to stimulate the renewable energy markets. That is not how I read it at all. It hoped to. It has a whole chapter about this is how we hope it's going to work, but that was not the design question. So how do you get outcomes if you don't start with the question in mind?
I think that's an excellent segue into the conversation around theories of change that you and I have had many times, which is the fact that, the standards and the standard setting processes are often really designed to help us understand transparently what's happening underneath the hood from a greenhouse gas accounting perspective. And for better or worse, and I think partially in response to sort of the reflexive mistrust of market-based mechanisms and approaches, we've sort of said, okay, that stuff doesn't count anymore. We want to try and push this all into attributional accounting. So maybe just explain the difference between attributional and consequential accounting for folks who are not immersed in this. And then I would just love to hear your thoughts on this whole conversation on theory of change and how that's showing up in the standards, both sort of existing standards and the standards update process, because I think it's actually really important for us collectively to be very clear-eyed about what is the end goal of this standard? What change are we trying to drive and how are we going to deliver that?
No, for sure. So first, on attributional versus consequential. Attributional is look, there's this system of emissions, system of electrons flowing around and they all have emissions and that we're going to sum that up in a pie. Attributional is this is your slice of the pie and this is mine just based on how much electricity we use. And if I'm going to say, well, I have the legal right to that cleaner source, that means you get less of the pie or more of the pie, depending on how you use this analogy. But the pie is not shrinking. We are trading claims around a system that maybe it's decarbonizing or not, but that's actually not what we're answering. We're saying, what is a valid claim to this is mine, that's yours. That's what it's saying. And that makes sense when, remember, these standards are being designed in an era out of Kyoto Protocol in the 2000s. Regulation was going to happen. You need to know your risks because that was going to flow down to your bottom line. Carbon pricing, claims mattered about, and they would eventually tie out with money, and that made sense. Consequential is asking, you did this action. Did the pie get bigger? Did the pie get smaller because of your action? And so that's really what we're trying to do, I think, today in this world of voluntary commitments. It's not as much of a risk assessment tool for regulation. It's what am I responsible for, which arguably is a policy call unto itself. And then what are actions I can take that are the best use of my company's resources, which again, I argue is credit and buying stuff, to shrink the amount of emissions, to shrink the pie. And when you look at it like that, plus all the really bad data out there that we can talk about out on the attributional side, I've come to the conclusion you can't do this in a fully attributional accounting system. It has to be consequential.
And just to double click on that for a minute, because I think it is so important and there is so much confusion on this set of topics specifically. What attributional accounting systems are really intended to do is to give us that static snapshot of the emissions associated with all the things that went in to make the pie at a particular given time, right? And then that usually is represented as an emissions factor that gets attached to that pie. And then as you divide that pie up, that emissions factor gets used in lots of different places, most actively in greenhouse gas inventories, both at the corporate level and at the national level. That consequential conversation, and one of the reasons why the Task Force for Corporate Action Transparency exists, is that we didn't have a place where we could really be clear and differentiated about what is happening as a result of actions that I am undertaking and what is happening because instead of using eggs, we're using oil in the pie. And that changed the emissions profile of the pie that then is getting pushed through. We need to be doing both of these things and we need to be doing them together, but they're actually fundamentally different but highly related accounting exercises. And I'll say again that the Science Based Targets Initiative is the first time we have ever tried to do target accounting with only inventory-based data. That's just not how you do target accounting in any other target accounting system in the world. And I think many greenhouse gas experts sort of squirm because it creates a lot of perverse incentives when you're trying to kind of push everything into the inventory and to have the inventory, especially your scope 3 inventory, be reflective of all of the mitigation actions and interventions you're undertaking across the system, because we just don't have sophisticated enough accounting systems for that yet. So maybe just say a couple more words about like how that all fits together and why you think this matters so much.
Yeah, I tell people you're not going to better data your way to scope 3 emission reduction. I've tried to do that through 8 years on the corporate side and working on data sets at GHG Protocol. It's not going to happen. Because even if you were to get to a unit process level of emissions from all of your suppliers, and I think you would have a team of about 100 people working on that over 5 years, and maybe not even that, I don't think. But even if you were to do that, what would you do to decarbonize it? If you're good at being credit worthy and buying a lot of stuff, shouldn't you do a bulk buy of biomethane to then address the natural gas and other fossil fuel emissions in your inventory? But if you have to physically deliver that biomethane to each specific facility in your value chain, the transaction costs and the delivery costs are high. It will never happen. And so I think this kind of obsession of granularity and visibility and matching that creates, it's not just a cost thing, it's a feasibility and it's an impact question. Are you going to go put the credit behind it to originate 10 new anaerobic digesters in Oregon? No, it's too hard. You're going to go try to buy credits that have already been generated, already backed by plants or a credit-worthy offtaker somewhere else, and do the matching because it's way too hard to do otherwise. And that's emblematic of what's happening in scope 2 is that some people think by thinking small, by looking at each megawatt hour, each time of day, that will help us kind of fill the decarbonization gaps of technologies we need to have long-term storage and decarbonize the most expensive or carbon-intensive hours of the day. And I applaud them for that theory. But I think what we've seen in the last 10 years with the corporate PPA space and what's worked and what's not is that large offtakes with only one, maybe handful of offtakers to reduce transaction costs get more projects financed than kind of inward-looking point-by-point matching.
Yeah, and I think the scale question is both the scale and the point of intervention questions are really important ones, right? Because the deeper you go in your supply chain, the more granular you get when you're trying to match every individual emissions source and, frankly, estimate in your inventory with an intervention that is right next door to that. Then you end up in a situation where, you are really incentivizing much smaller, much more expensive interventions as opposed to what you're talking about, which is how do we incentivize much larger, higher impact system level interventions and
Yeah.
decarbonization solutions? And I think there is no right answer to that question, I don't think, but we have got to come up with a compromise soon, because this war that we're in right now in both scope 2 and more broadly in greenhouse gas accounting is just hurting all of us and impeding our ability to make progress. So if you could rewrite the playbook for corporate climate leadership today, like, what would that emphasize that these current frameworks are missing? How would you change kind of the status quo to better reflect these realities that we're talking about?
I would first start by what claim can you say about your numbers once you do it? So the inventory says these are the emissions allocated to my purchases versus the inventory represents the emissions I have helped reduce. Like, those are two different statements, and we're trying to do the second with tools from the first. That doesn't make any sense. And then I would just be agnostic about different theories of change and create systems that support one, and the companies can lean into what they're good at. So if your company has great relationships with a handful of suppliers, you're vertically integrated, you work hand in glove with them on all of the design process, product design, shipment, like, you should lean into what I call the supplier cascade theory, which is by engaging my supplier and they engage their supplier and they engage theirs, we're going to change out every boiler at all these factories in country X. And that's really the implicit theory, or the kosher theory of the corporate climate space today. And if you're good at that, go for it. I worked for about 5 years at the retailer Target. They buy thousands, if not a million SKUs of products from suppliers all over the world, and yet they're not, as a retailer, a significant portion of any one supplier's business. I'm going to say this is my personal opinion, that strategy does not work for a company like Target. But if you look at this other approach, which I would call making markets, and I would really laud Microsoft for this, because they're doing a lot of things, but they are known for their focus on carbon removal projects. And they're saying, look, we're large, we're creditworthy, we're here to stay. If we do a lot of offtake agreements in these expensive, capital intensive projects, we can help bring down the cost curve, build a market, and then it'll be accessible for others. And that's really what tech companies did in the beginning of the renewable energy PPA industry. And so their strategy is not, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, they kind of got kicked out of SBTI. They were not revalidated, or whatever the terminology is. But that's what their company is good at, and they're doing great work.
Yeah.
And so which one of these is right? A lot of coaches say lean into your strengths and don't make a Microsoft do point by touch point engagement strategy if it's not right for them.
Yeah. And I think that is a big part of kind of threading this needle, is just recognizing that not every company is a super profitable, enormous tech company that's willing to build a 200-person sustainability team and is willing to do the work to go deep in the supply chain and do the data mapping and do the supplier engagement. But that there is still meaningful and important action they can take with a team of two, tapping into a lot of the systems and markets that we've already built as well. And I think the faster we can create space for those different roles and contributions, the more likely it is we'll really be able to scale up climate action and voluntary action in particular, which of course now in the United States is more important than ever, and for which 85% of companies are doing nothing. So we spend so much time focusing on the few companies that are doing something. We have just given a total pass to the companies that are doing nothing. And so how do we create those on-ramps for the companies that are not Microsoft and are never going to be Microsoft? I think is one of the big questions that we collectively need to answer in the next little bit. So we have a lot of deer in headlights, I feel like right now, especially on the corporate side, where, I talk to companies all the time and they say, oh, we're waiting for the rules to get clear. We're not signing new contracts. We're not buying things, or we're going to buy something for a year, but we're not going to be able to keep buying it because we're not sure it's going to count. And,
Yeah, so sad.
it has to count for something in order for us to justify spending millions of additional dollars. And so
Yeah.
what kind of advice do you have for companies today while we're navigating this complicated and interstitial period where the guidance really isn't clear yet?
Yeah. So one of my favorite shows, and we talked about this, is Mad Men. And I use most like Don Draper quotes in like most of my professional life, I feel like. But if you don't like what's happening or what they're saying, change the conversation. And for me, it gets back to during my time at GHG protocol and what if you read the scope 2 guidance, they're asking, how do we divide up the pie? How do we assign based on contracts or other things the right emissions to whom? Your companies, if you're trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, that's not your primary question. You need to look to other systems because you're going to keep running into the same problem if you're using the wrong tool for your purpose at hand. And it's scary because it's so much easier to say, I'm sticking with the standards. I'm going to wait. I'm not going to do anything until I have clarity because that's where most companies are at. And if you stick your neck out there and do something that's, quote, not in the standard, which is a misnomer, you're afraid to get blowback and you're doing offsetting, which well, you know more about that than me. But I often think about George Carlin, like mine's an inset and yours an offset. Like it's the exact same damn project at the end of the day.
Yep.
But I would this is actually potentially a great opportunity. We're not going to have clarity from greenhouse gas protocol for 2 to 3 years. There's still, if you read the scope 2 draft, they still believe in this kind of like look down, count match by match theory of change, thinking that will increase demand for RECs at certain times, despite what you said that actually very small percentage of companies are actually doing this. And then that will bring the supply of new technologies. And that's not what we've seen in the market. So they actually aren't answering the question people need to answer. They're doubling down on the system that got them here. And this is opportunity for companies to say, that's great about matching and kind of like, I use this electron claim. I'm going to use my credit and buying power to go decarbonize electricity around the world or with different technologies that don't necessarily issue RECs. And that's the best use. And there are standards out there that are coming in when we need them to enable that. So you really just need to think about, what am I doing? What's its purpose? And pick the right tool for that. If it's not this is my slice of the pie tool or question, you need to move on. You need to find a different tool.
And I think that exact point was a big driver for the TCAT guidance in particular, in a world where there's a lot of people paying attention to what companies are saying, and the lack of guidance means that it's increasingly risky for companies to say anything.
Yeah.
How do you make sure that the things you are saying are transparent, are substantiated, and ideally third-party assured? And so part of the goal of that guidance, which you obviously were heavily involved in, is really to help provide just that basis of transparency so that we don't pick winners or force companies into one set of actions or another right now, but we're really saying, if you are taking action, and we hope you are, here's how you talk about it. And I think increasingly that's going to need to be the space we move into as companies do their best to navigate this incredibly dynamic and challenging kind of political, geopolitical environment that we're all operating in globally. So I think that's good advice. And I think we always say, just be transparent, substantiate, be factual when you're talking about what you're doing, but do not wait because we're in a climate emergency and we can't.
Yeah.
So on that front, I always like to close with asking people what's getting them out of bed in the morning and what's making you feel hopeful these days. So besides your toddlers, who I know get us up all earlier than we would like to.
Yeah. Yeah, that's in our conversation. I think, so I work in the US electric market. Is a turbulent time. We have policies we thought were going to be around for 10 years, gone in the next year. We have load growth, astronomical, we haven't seen in decades. And it is actually creating some very creative projects that I've seen. I've seen some very interesting energy storage agreements that companies are, again, stepping up and taking long-term credit offtake commitments to, and that's getting those financed and put on the grid, which we know allows for more renewable energy, which is often being curtailed, to be absorbed and dispatched when the grid really needs it. What's interesting is that when the kind of scope 2 guidance was started, the revision process was started 6 years ago when people started talking about it, like this was going to be the tool to get us to battery dispatch and long-term storage and new nuclear. And that's already happening. And we need more of it, tons of it. But the market is responding and companies are seeing opportunities to lean in to both reduce emissions and to help to make a hedge off their energy costs. So I don't know. It's kind of an exciting time. Don't know how the story is going to turn out, but each day I kind of come across a new project or a new idea someone's had. And necessity is the mother of invention, and people need electricity.
Always. It's the most important sector for us to be focusing on. And I think one of the things the IPCC is the clearest about in terms of being a tippy top priority. Holly, obviously we could talk for 3 days about all of these things, but thank you so much for joining me today. Thanks for all the work you do broadly, and really looking forward to continuing the conversation.
Thanks for having me, Alexia. See you soon.
That's it for this episode of Navigating Net Zero. If you enjoyed the conversation, be sure to follow or subscribe, and help us spread the word by sharing this episode with your friends and colleagues. Thank you for listening. Until next time, be well and keep up the great work.